Welcome to another episode of the Agronomy Highlights podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Spellman, and I'm joined here with my lovely co-host and colleague, Justin Brackenrich. Justin, how are you doing today?
I'm good, Ryan. How are you doing today?
Justin, I'm living the dream, and I
As
really am
always.
today. Yeah, as always,
Yeah.
I'm always living the dream, and particularly today because we get to talk about plant pathology, which is near and dear to my heart.
Everyone's favorite.
Everyone's favorite, right?
Yeah,
Why
yeah,
wouldn't
yeah.
it be? Yeah, who doesn't like fungi, bacteria, viruses? If you don't, you can keep scrolling.
No, well,
Uh,
if you don't, you can hang out today, and maybe by the end of the next hour, you'll be converted and it will be one of your favorite topics, right?
that's right. That's right. Let us draw you into the
Yeah.
wonderful, wacky world of plant pathology here. I think there's a lot of really valuable information in here. And we did an episode, what, 3 episodes ago, 4 episodes ago, that we talked a little bit about assessing your small grain in the field and assessing your stands and your tillering. So this is kind of a great continuation of that conversation. We're in a point this time of year where your tillering phases are kind of starting to taper off depending on where you are in the state, and we're really quickly moving into stem elongation phases and then thinking about flowering and heading as we move into some of these later spring months. So with that, there's a lot of disease that we have to think about. And particularly one thing that I always think about as we move into this part of the season is head scab. I think I get a lot of calls in August asking me what happened, or farmers preparing for fungicide applications earlier in the season without a thought for what's about to happen. So let's talk about exactly how to assess this, what to be thinking about as we move into this part of the year. How do we protect our crops and all of those fun things? What do you think, Justin?
I'm ready. Let's do it.
Yeah. All right. Well, we have a few guests on our show today that we've had here before to some extent. And today we have Dr. Paul Esker and Dr. Alyssa Collins. Both of them are specialists on our team and plant pathologists themselves. So we'll have them introduce themselves. So we'll start with you, Paul. Thanks for coming on today.
Yeah, no problem, Ryan and Justin. Thanks for having me back. And I do enjoy the wonderful, wacky kind of context you set this up. I don't know if you were talking about your guest today or what we're talking about. So either way, it's fine. Yeah, just for everyone, yeah, I'm Paul Esker, plant pathologist, epidemiologist, kind of do research and extension here at Penn State. Multiple crops, multiple things. We do stuff. That's the easiest way to kind of describe it. But as you'll see, Alyssa and I work very closely together on a lot of these topics, especially this one in particular.
Yeah, and I'm Alyssa Collins. I'm an associate research professor in the same department that Paul is in, and I too am a fungus enthusiast. So that goes right on the resume. And I actually also run a research center in Lancaster County that Penn State owns. It's basically a farm that is a laboratory. So we're located in different places, but that helps us because we also get to experience the different conditions that farmers experience across the state. And so my location is probably a little bit more like the Mid-Atlantic, while Paul is located in an area that's more like the Northeast, areas like Upper Ohio and New York. So we get to experience that range, and that helps us, especially with managing and understanding diseases like the one we're about to talk about.
Yeah, thanks, guys. I think the cool part about having both of you on today is we have two different parts of the states represented here. Alyssa is in the southeastern part of the state, located at our CREC, our I guess that's Lancaster County,
Yep.
and then Paul is at our University Park area in Center County. So we kind of have two regions of the state, and we can talk about where the crops are currently and where our risks are, what kind of diseases are common in both of those areas, and have a good idea of that. So maybe we can start there. So at this time of year, what are we seeing in the field? What progress is our wheat and barley at what growth stage, and what are the diseases that we're starting to think about, and maybe what's the what are the diseases we need to prepare for?
Alyssa, do you want to start down by you, and then I can fill in a little bit from up this way?
Yeah, so we're usually about 2 weeks ahead of the state college location in terms of crop progress. But this year, maybe not so much. We've been kind of at the same level for a couple of weeks now. So at this time, speaking today on April 17th, our crops are probably in week 6 or 7. And, green up has already happened. Folks have already applied their herbicides and their nitrogen, things like that. And now they're waiting to see what happens next. So the things we are usually concerned about keeping an eye on at this point in terms of disease in small grains, including wheat and barley, are fungal diseases like powdery mildew. These are actually diseases that can be controlled really well with some genetics that you already have paid for. So hopefully in the fall, you selected a variety that has some resistance to powdery mildew, because there's a lot of great options out there. And then we typically don't get much benefit from a fungicide application at this stage right now. Even though it's a really easy and convenient time to apply it because you're already going across the field for your nitrogen, your herbicide, we usually don't get an economic benefit except in special locations and situations. So right now it's pretty quiet in our wheat and our barley, and we're just watching and scouting so that we can see if anything odd happens. Sometimes right now people are surprised that maybe their crop coming out of the winter did not survive as well as they thought it would. So maybe some crown death, some weak tillering, things like that. Sometimes we're seeing things that pop up as viruses, and those can really throw people for a loop because those are pretty hard to diagnose for even plant pathologists, let alone, your average farmer who might not be a fungus enthusiast and other disease enthusiasts. So these are the sorts of things that start to become questions for folks coming out of the winter right now for us in this region.
Yeah, I'll just add, Ryan, Alyssa really did a nice job laying out kind of the situation this year. And I would say growth stage wise, we're probably slightly behind, but overall, I think we're behind in general. We've had a cool spring in relative terms, but I always remember when one of the students we had who came from Brazil, Maera Dufek, and we were talking about this. She was more familiar with spring wheat. I said, just wait. Well, all it takes is a couple really nice warm days, 80-ish, 82, 83, whatever, and you will see the crop, barley, wheat, you'll see that crop just take off, and then we'll be racing through the growth stages. So time will tell, but we are behind, and it's interesting because I think of the weather this year, we're not seeing much of anything. We're not hearing much of anything. I think we had the same thing in our most recent extension team call. And so I concur, fungicide decision making right now is really a non-starter in my world. And then for us, it's going to be what starts to occur probably that first week of May as we go forward. And that's really when it becomes everything. And I'm also basing this on our most recent data coming from large scale on-farm trials where we see we can hold off and wait and really focus on what we have to do for scab in particular, and then see the value added benefit for any late season foliar diseases on top.
For all of us that may be listening that aren't small grain or fungus enthusiasts and stuff, I'm going to put a link to how we growth stage small grains, because we kind of throw out these things like growth stage 5 or 6, or we use terms like feeks or something like that. And small grains are a little less intuitive than something like maybe corn or soybeans, where we kind of go through this R or V or something like that for reproductive and vegetative, and a lot of times we're counting leaves or something, right? I mean, any of us can count leaves to an extent, so it can be a little bit more challenging if you're not familiar with that. Ohio State has a really nice guide where they went through and took a bunch of pictures. And so I'll throw that in the notes for anybody that wants to kind of dig into that and get a little bit more of an idea of what we're talking about.
Yeah, Justin, that's a really, really important point. So with small grains at this time of year, as we move forward, like right now, you need to have a knife. You need to be able to section that plant, look for where the nodes are, which you can feel. And then you start counting the leaves as they come out, and the growth stage kind of follows the pattern of the alternating leaf structure. And then the flag leaf, which around this time of year, in maybe an average year, in a typical year, we might start to see it down by Alyssa pretty soon, if not already. That's the one that looks like it's just the flags going straight up on you, and then we switch gears looking where the head is. But it is definitely one you have to have a knife out there. We also, it reminds me, we do have some videos on Penn State Extension website. We did it several years ago where we dissect plants and show that as well, if you wanted to share that with the listeners.
So it sounds like we're actually kind of jumping right into the flag leaf diseases. So let's start there. So you kind of mentioned this idea of the flag leaf, and I know this is something we always talk about protecting. You mentioned, Alyssa, some of these diseases like powdery mildew, rust, foliar diseases that we might start to see in the early part of the season, and that genetic resistance is really one of our best options for management. Now, how should we look at these diseases, scout these diseases, and assess later on in the season, should we make an application, and how does the leaf that's effective matter in that story?
Yeah, this is really nice information that we have about wheat and some other small grains that helps determine when we're going to get the most bang for our buck with a fungicide application. So for wheat, most of the photosynthetic activity that goes to fill that grain, so your leaves that are solar panels for, making grain, the most important one is going to be that flag leaf for wheat. It accounts for 43% of the photosynthate that's produced that then goes into making your dollar, right? If you're a grain farmer, if you're using this for another use like forage, that could be a little different in your math. But we're usually talking about like selling some of this grain. And so that's huge, right? So your flag leaf is not out yet currently, in our area. That means a fungicide application isn't going to protect that most important tissue. And so that's one of the reasons we rarely see an economic advantage to a fungicide application at like the Feeks 5, Feeks 6 growth stage. And so we really want to hold back, because if we're only going to go across the field once with a fungicide, we want to make it count. Everyone's trying to rub pennies together to make sure that they are living within their ability to make a dollar here. And we want to be mindful of that. But also, every fungicide application that we introduce to our field does allow potentially for the fungus that's already out there that may not be infecting yet, but is surviving out there, to develop some resistance against those chemistries. And so I also think about it in the long term that way. We have these tools, we want to preserve them because they're useful right now. So let's think about maybe how we hang on to them for our most important uses, and not necessarily use them just for an insurance application. So for wheat, that flag leaf is really important. That's the one we're looking to protect from diseases, and that would be later in the season. Barley, it's a little bit different. For barley, it's earlier. Most of their photosynthate is produced by the leaf below the flag leaf and also their stem. So they get a lot of action out of that stem too. So we might be talking about a little bit earlier if you do see diseases when you're scouting on your leaves for barley, because that's just a bit of a different plant. But some of the diseases we start scouting for when we start stem elongation include what you mentioned. So your powdery mildew, rusts, there are some fungal leaf spots that also could start to develop, but we typically don't see them until further towards the end of the season. So it would be kind of rare to see a lot of them right now, but it's absolutely worth scouting, because if you do see them early, well, then you know you've got to make some decisions.
So with some of these flag leaf diseases, we're also kind of floated around this idea of seeing how much disease we have on the flag leaf to make our decision. And you know, usually we might consider that a threshold, right? So do we have information out there on what thresholds, if we're scouting and saying, okay, is it time that I protect this flag leaf? You know, is there an element of how early you catch it and a percentage of diseased tissue that's at play here? How can farmers like tangibly make that decision right now? This is the time to protect the flag leaf. It's going to impact my yield.
Yeah, so it depends on the disease, and that's why proper ID is important. So if you're not really confident on what disease you're looking at, that's a great time to call your extension educator, because they have the resources to do that. And so let's say, for instance, we're talking about powdery mildew, because that's usually the earliest one that we would be experiencing. For barley, it's a little bit different again than for wheat. But some of the research has suggested that if you see 5% of the leaf area on your lowest green leaves, that would be a time to consider applying a fungicide. Again, it rarely happens for us, but in those cases, you probably would benefit from a fungicide. For wheat, we're looking at a little bit higher in the canopy there, so mid to upper canopy. And again, an average of like 3 to 5% of that leaf area covered to then prevent further damage with a fungicide. For some of the fungal leaf splotches or blotches, it's the threshold is larger, right? Like you would have to get to at least a quarter of your leaves having blotches that are growing and expanding. But then for something like a leaf rust, it's actually much lower. So you would be looking at an average of 1 pustule per leaf. So these are different because these different diseases move and ultimately have different impact on your yield. And so it is worth trying to figure out which disease you're dealing with and what point you are in the season, and also what your weather looks like from then on out, because that is a huge factor that we rarely can control. So as much information as you can get about that, and knowing how that then could impact your ability for that disease to then take off is really important.
Great. Yeah. So proper identification, it always starts there. And we do have a handful of these foliar diseases, and each one has maybe their own parameters. You kind of brought up this in barley and wheat, right? It's different because of that contribution of the flag leaf. So your threshold is going to depend on the cereal crop you're growing, the pathogen you're dealing with, and its life cycle as well. So that's where identification helps, and we could probably spend a whole episode maybe answering that question for each of these. I'll spare you guys, and we'll provide some resources here. There's a resource from Penn State Extension on scouting small grains and looking for some of these. And I will try to plug a resource in there for you to find. I think Crop Protection Network probably has some good information on thresholds in some of these diseases. So maybe from there, let's jump into head blight. This is the big one, right? So as we move into head emergence and then flowering, this is really the thing that if you haven't applied a fungicide, I know a lot of my farmers, if they don't apply a fungicide for anything else, they always apply a fungicide when the heads are out. And we have maybe some messages about if you should or should not do that. But let's talk about scab. What is scab? What's the big deal with scab? Why are we concerned about it?
Scab is the big one because not only does it impact your yield and quality, but the fungus that causes scab can also produce mycotoxins. So several mycotoxins, but the one we're most often concerned about is deoxynivalenol or DON or vomitoxin. And so farmers are often yes, concerned about their yield, but also about that because they've experienced rejection at mills, and they want to know more about why and what they can do to prevent it.
Yeah, this is the because of that mycotoxin issue, and you know, I think commonly we all refer to it as vomitoxin. I get a lot of folks thinking about mycotoxins after the point that it's too late, right? They go to the mill and their grain gets rejected, and then it's a conversation, okay, what can we do with this grain now, right? So what can we learn about so we really want to protect not just because this disease limits your yield. It produces these toxins that especially for feeding to livestock can cause some gastrointestinal issues. So Paul, maybe you can take this. What's the life cycle of scab causing diseases? And maybe why do we want to protect them when we're seeing heads appear?
Yeah, and what I'm gonna do is focus on kind of a Pennsylvania specific. It'll vary a little bit by where you are in the wheat production regions, because I think one of the things we have here in Pennsylvania that drives the disease cycle is the fact we have wheat in close proximity with corn. And so the pathogen's going to overwinter in the residues very well. And the fact that we know in corn this causes ear rot, stalk rot, things like that. We have nice reservoirs for it. So starting there, and so just for our more mid-Atlantic, northeastern type audience, for us, our assumption is inoculum is not going to be the limiting factor in this environment. So the disease cycle starts with that base. What we need to do is, as we get into that period, and when we talk maybe about prediction models, this becomes even more relevant, is there are going to be certain conditions of moisture, temperature, and temperature, humidity, factors like that are going to drive the release of the spores that can cause infection. And so this is really important because what occurs at that point is, depending where we're at in barley with heading. So we talk a lot about heading in barley as our key indicator point. We talk about very early flowering in wheat. Subtle difference there just in terms of the growth stage in many respects. But those are going to be where these spores land, cause infection, and eventually lead to disease. And so what you can see there is, if you have the right conditions, and I think one of the biggest challenges we have is, even with solid prediction models, is we can get subtle differences from day to day or over several day period. If we get a lot of rain on a Monday, let's say, and then we get 3 days of dry, it does change the risk in some respects. And then the switch turns off and on, and the spores release at different times. So what happens there is we get an infection occurring in the head or in the flowers at that time, and then you can often see where infection is based on the symptomology. You get it on the head in different locations, because if you recall, flowering is going to kind of start centrally on the head in wheat, and then work its way out as we go forward over a handful of days. And so we can get different infections at different points there. And so we get infection occurring, we get symptom development, which can vary. It can be the pinkish kernel, the bleach kernel, the shriveled kernel type effect. We often see the orangish spore mat in those grains as well. And that in and of itself doesn't lead to mycotoxin contamination. It helps facilitate it, but that secondary metabolite then will potentially form based on several factors. And we get that disease developing, and then we get into the harvest season. Pathogen survives again in residue, and then we move into actually decision making for corn later in the season, what may or may not occur. So it kind of has this nice little, I guess you could call it almost like a figure skating 8, going back and forth between the two crops in our sort of system. And we also know one of the big things with the disease cycle, or the life cycle in general, is that soybean will not necessarily break that up. There's evidence, there's been work done to show that the pathogen at least can survive through that rotation as well. So we start with that idea of inoculum's always there. It's in the residue, it kind of builds up. Then we have the right environmental conditions of relative humidity, moisture, plus temperature, releases spores, cause infection, completes the life cycle in the host, and then we go through harvest and we start over with some of that. So keeping it very, very general. I mean, the temperatures, moderate to warm, I would say at that level. But the hardest part is what happens from day to day during these periods. And I think, Alyssa, we've seen this. We can see what may look like an unfavorable year at one of the locations where we do a lot of our research and look slightly more favorable. But if the growth stage is slightly off either of those in one direction or the other, it changes the interaction. So a year like last year, I think we were getting dry down by you, Alyssa. Yet when we looked at the final data for scab and then eventually vomitoxin, the levels were higher because at the critical moment of infection, the conditions were good. And so this is why it's complicated for a lot of farmers. And I think it also starts with being able to identify what do we mean by heading, what do we mean by anthesis or early flowering in wheat. So the willingness to go out there, we're scouting, truthfully, we scout on a daily basis during these times, at least to quickly get a sense of what growth stage are we at as we look forward. And that's what we try to report to everybody because we know not everybody is able to do that.
So, Paul, I think for me is you touched on two things that I'd like to circle back to. One is not a lot of people understand or know the concept that wheat flowers, right? And I think we can generally state, like even our concept of corn itself flowering, right? Like we think of flowers or pretty petals and all of the things, but talk us through a little bit about wheat flowering. And the second thing I want to put out there is, again, I'm a novice pathologist, so you guys excuse my ignorance on this. But generally speaking, we can identify some of this fusarium in corn or wheat by that pinkish color, right? Is that a pretty safe assessment that when we're seeing these pink molds in our corn, let's say last year, that's a pretty good indicator that we need to be out there really scouting for that stuff, because a lot of us, molds can get pretty confusing. Funguses can get kind of confusing because they kind of all, there might be one shade of green means it's this one, and a little darker hue of green isn't. It's like going to Sherwin-Williams to get your paint. But specifically the pink to orange one might be where we can kind of hone in. So those are the two things I'd like to kind of follow up with.
So you're right on the growth staging. It's complicated, and I think even as a group of pathologists, we meet annually for specifically on this topic. We have a long history of funding to support scab research, and even there's lots of discussion and debates on how do we identify what do we all call Feeks 10.5.1 early anthesis. And it's sort of the ad hoc-ish rule of thumb is 50% of that population, and a population here might be your field. Well, that also makes one recognize some of those plants are further along, more flowers, you look at it, and some are still not there yet. And so it's interesting. I actually asked this question in this exam yesterday for one of our doctoral students, because what that student did, they defined the growth stage by 80 to 90% because they wanted to be absolutely sure they were taking samples at that growth stage. Now the risk, this was in corn, but it's the same sort of principle. They wanted to make sure they got it past more or less the end of sort of whatever's left over of any vegetative as you're transitioning into reproductive growth. They wanted it to be clearly there. And I think that's hard because oftentimes the type of question I will get on growth stage, they'll send us a photo and the whole head has the flowers on it from the middle out and everything else. And you're like, well, Now we actually have to think, would you be off label if you decide to make an application? Because that's several days after what we're talking about. That's 4 to 6 days easily.
And the
At
importance
that
of
point.
that is, and maybe we'll get there, maybe we won't, but some of these fungicides that we're talking about are very specific to point of flowering, right? Some of them work if you're at flowering, some of them can go before, you know, every time the label's the law, right? And so as we're making recommendations, they may work if we're past this point of flowering, but we can't make the recommendation because technically we're off label. And so that's the importance of why we're spending all this time talking about flowering, and why we would say get out there every day, look your flowering, understand what that means. And this is the point where you start to see like little yellow things hanging off of the wheat, right? This isn't, they're not going to open up and have this beautiful purple or red or pink flower hanging off, but they start to get these little yellow things hanging off of them, and they might look like pollen granules or something from a distance, but that's kind of the point we're targeting, right?
Yeah, exactly. And they're, by the way, they're beautiful in their own right. They have once you see them, your eyes kind of open up. But
We'll start seeing if
on.
we can landscape with wheat moving forward for the beauty of the wheat flower.
Well, that golden hue as we push through is actually quite nice. That's what people latch on. So going to your question though, I was just checking on the fungicide efficacy tables because we do put harvest restrictions on a lot of those. And because it really, thankfully, for most of the compounds that would target scab, their harvest restriction is actually shifted to a 30-day pre-harvest interval. And I think for us with our grain field period, that's not usually a concern unless we get really dry and things change. I think we have a longer window. But there are some compounds, Miravis Ace being one example, that is 10.5.4, which you would have to pay attention to. You would have to pay attention to if you're at full flowering at that point. And so those are important. Now, going to your second question, I think in the small grain world, yeah, the oranges, the reddish orange sort of appearance is usually more telltale. It's harder in corn because we do see a lot of different things that we have to tease apart there with the ear rots to stalk rots. But on the wheat side, I think that is usually a telltale symptom we can look for. But now I want everybody to keep in mind there are different species of Fusarium that can cause Fusarium head scab, although we emphasize because it's the most predominant Fusarium graminearum. But if somebody was looking up this information online, they may see other species be mentioned depending on where they are. From a practical perspective, having overseen part of our management research action committee, from a more technical side, it doesn't change the decision-making process. It probably doesn't change what you're seeing, but I just want everybody to understand that when you look at it, while we usually focus on one species, it may be some other things that way. So it's all really important to kind of to keep in mind here, but that's not always going to be the most telltale symptom. Sometimes our best symptoms are once we harvest, because then we actually see it in the grain lot, and we see a variety of things. Shriveled grain is actually usually a good one to look for. The bleach grain, although the bleach grain with our weather, if we get cold snaps at the wrong time, that there's things that can mimic it as well.
I wanted to jump in and just mention, when we're talking about seeing those orangey kernels, that's going to be about 3 weeks after the infection took place. And so when we talk about scouting, there are certain things we can scout about to decide on a fungicide application, but we can't do that with scab, not effectively anyway, because we're seeing it after the fact. So there are other tools though that can help us with that, which we can talk about whenever you would like to.
Yeah, let's do that.
I think that's a great transition. Yeah.
Yeah,
so
let's talk about the tools that we can use to.
Yeah, what can we do? I mean, we're all
right.
farming like to our constraints, right? And sometimes a lot of this is really complicated, so it's nice to talk about what we can control. And so one of the things that Paul mentioned, there's a large group of scientists who have been working since the 1990s specifically on this disease. And it's not just pathology nerds like ourselves, it's also food scientists, it's also geneticists, breeders, a whole group really dedicated to this and funded federally. So we've been working across the nation. And through this, some tools have been developed because of, needing the boots on the ground decision-making aids here. One of those is what's called the Fusarium risk tool. This is a very unsexy name for something that can be really useful. And basically, it's a prediction tool. It's a map that shows all of the wheat growing regions in the country and into Canada a little bit. And it tells you based on your conditions, it's reading from weather stations across the country, what conditions you have right now that are favorable to this disease taking place, happening, infecting right now. So the way it works then is you have to come with the knowledge of what stage your crop is at right now. Because if you've got really great conditions for disease to develop, but you're only at Feeks 5, you've only got a few leaves on that plant, it doesn't matter, right? You don't need to apply a fungicide or anything else because this fungus only infects through those flowers. That's why this timing and growth staging is so important, because the fungus kind of is terrible at getting into the plant other ways. And so that is a great thing to know, because we know then that there's only this one window for our crop that is vulnerable. So that's a good thing. It's also a good thing that we know what conditions the fungus likes to sporulate in. And when it makes spores, those spores fly around and can infect things. So when those two things line up together, that's when we have to protect the head. And so if you visit this tool, you'll see your area lit up in a color that's either, we're not in that time of your crop yet, and that's kind of gray. But then you start getting colors that are, indicating low, medium, and high risk. You can look at this tool in the days leading up to when you think you're going to start flowering and kind of predict, maybe it would be a good idea for me to apply a fungicide now, or maybe I could wait. Because combining this and combining a good, effective, well-timed fungicide together with any genetic resistance that you might have in your plant is actually pretty effective in reducing the chances of you getting this disease and then getting the toxin. So there are a lot of layers that you can use to push in your favor.
Yeah, no, I just would add to Alyssa's comment, and probably an additional really valuable piece to what Alyssa was just describing with the scab prediction is that this system also provides for expert commentary, which Alyssa would contribute. We go back and forth, we compare our notes, so we give context to what, much like we are doing today, we give context to what we're seeing in the field, what other things might we be seeing in the field. And I think that's as valuable because we're taking what we were describing, the challenge with growth staging, and saying, hey, down by Alyssa in Lancaster County, they are coming into flowering, whereas up here in the center part of the state, we are 7 to 10 days or whatever it may be behind, because these are the growth stages we're seeing. And then as we go further north up towards, say, the New York border, where there's some small grain production, that might even be delayed by a couple weeks. So that context, I think, is another valuable piece to it. Plus, we package that into our field crop news, our weekly newsletter during this time of year. And we're not going to report if there's really, we're going to try to emphasize it's what's going on out there. We're not going to try to scare anybody and just, interpret what we're seeing and everything in that. But there are multiple ways to get this information.
Yeah, I think that commentary is important. As I'm looking at this tool, and this is a tool that I try to get as many growers as I can to use this. One of the things that maybe we can discuss a little farther in actually using this tool. So for those of you that are listening and maybe not looking at this tool, you basically have risk that's forecasted out on a 2-day interval up to 6 days. So you have a 2-day risk, 4-day risk, 6-day risk. And then there's a no risk or no analysis. There's a low risk, medium, and high risk, right? So let's say you are in an area that's medium or high risk, and you're going into that in the next day or two, you're going to go into that early anthesis, early flowering period. How do you use this information, right? Does that mean that if I'm high risk for the next 6 days, that means, yep, I need to apply a fungicide if I'm coming into early anthesis? If I'm at medium, does that mean that's the case, or is that where that commentary comes in?
Yeah, it's kind of a yes and situation. And it's very individual to the grower, right? And even on the same farm, you might have different fields that you treat differently because they're a different variety, or you know that you've got different flowering timing on the hillside that you grow on. There can be lots of different factors, not least of which is, can you get someone to come apply a fungicide? Because conditions typically are not isolated to a farm. So if you've got good conditions for disease development, your neighbor down the road might as well, and they're also trying to get sprayed. So again, I would say of all the diseases we deal with, a fungicide for this disease is probably the most valuable in wheat across the board, and barley, I would say, just from a quality and food safety standpoint. Usually we're a little conservative about saying go spray a fungicide. I know I am, but this one, we do have really effective fungicides that can never get us quite 100% because of the way that wheat flowers. It doesn't flower all at once. So we're trying to hit the middle and get the most we can out of our application, because you're not going to go out and spray every day, right, to get every one of those flowers. So we layer this protection, and fungicide is just one of those layers to combine with maybe spreading your risk with multiple varieties that flower at different times. Or let's see, what else can we do that way? We can see about different approaches to applying a fungicide. And, it's really a personal choice whether you're going to go with spray for a medium risk level. We know that weather can change pretty quickly. And so all of this is just to help guide. It's not a hard and fast, you better pull the trigger now. It comes from your experience too as a grower or a crop consultant or another ag professional. And there are different fungicides that are available, so different choices there. Usually, we're getting our best efficacy after flowering has begun, but early in flowering. So the later we get from the beginning of flowering, we still have efficacy, but it reduces, it drops over time. We very rarely get a good result from a fungicide application before flowering begins. So that's an important thing to consider as you're watching your season play out, because there are certain things not within your control, and maybe you want to get out there and you want to spray as soon as you can because you want to protect your crop. You've got to know that you're not getting very good efficacy if you try to do it before you start flowering. There is one of the fungicides that does have that on the label, like just pre-flowering, but it's still more effective if you've already started flowering.
And Ryan, I would just add, or Justin, in this case, the prediction windows that are available help you understand what the forecast, how you integrate the weather forecast in there, because I think on our small plot, and I think we're up in the 600 to 700 plot range across the 2 locations for our trials. These are the same things we have to take into account. not that we're monitoring to is the risk favorable to spray. We kind of lock those in our treatment protocols, but when should we spray if we're not 100% sure what the weather's going to look like in 8 hours, 12 hours, 16 hours? That 0246 really can help you coordinate with the local cooperative, figure out what works best, knowing there are caveats. Efficacy does change as we get further into flowering accordingly. But I think that's really, really important to understand, because in the past, this disease, why it is so important was most of the compounds had to hit it just right. And if you had rain for multiple days, you were kind of done. And you because the way the labels were and everything else, we've seen the window widen just a bit, but recognizing what is maybe optimum and what are secondary, tertiary type events where you still get control, some degree of control, maybe not as good as if you hit it, but that still can be very important post-harvest, when we're talking about potential for mycotoxin issues.
So I have up make sure I get the title right, the updated efficacy fungicide efficacy for weed control from the Crop Protection Network. And I'm kind of scrolling through some of these, and I guess I'll ramble a moment as I get on my soapbox as a novel pathologist, right? And I'm sure it's much worse for you all, but I think it's one of these things that we want to treat all fungal things with one fungicide, right? And I think we've not only mentioned that there's the timing associated with that, but as we start to look at this, the same as our weeds or the same as any of our other problems, not everything treats everything. And I guess we think about this as like medicines or something, or cream, or I don't know why we think that this simplified with funguses and bacterias and stuff, but like, yeah, sure, one ought to take care of all 10 things that I'm seeing. It doesn't work that way, right? And as I scroll down through this list, specifically looking at head scab, there are a tremendous amount that have like no label, that have poor or little to no activity. Actually, there's maybe 5, if my numbers are right, that the best options we have are good coverage, right? We have very good and we have excellent above that we're not actually seeing in that efficacy. Is that because we don't have great options? Is it because of resistance? Is it because of the timing and the flowering? What causes us to have that reduction in efficacy when we're talking specifically about head scab?
I would start with your last answer first, which is really the timing, meaning, and here I'm talking about timing, the fact, as Alyssa mentioned, flowering doesn't one day everything flowers. It's not one of those events and then we go out and we protect and we do our stuff, or we can predict that well. There's a range there, and so when we talk about good efficacy for the compounds you're seeing in that list, those are actually really effective fungicides when you look across the board. Most of those, if I'm not mistaken, are going to have very good, excellent efficacy for other foliar diseases and things like that. So we know they work. It's the challenge of that head and protecting the flowers, and then recognizing that varies from head to head across a field. And so 50, 60, 70% efficacy is actually quite good if we knock the disease back, what we see visually, and then hopefully then we knock the mycotoxin contamination after the fact down further. So that's where I usually start, because and it's also, how we spray, we use a dual fan type combination there in that respect. So we're hitting it front and we're hitting it back in that respect, because that's really important, that you're not just running across it in one direction, you're hitting the head properly accordingly. So that's usually where I think about that efficacy issue, is just trying to protect the head as best as possible. The compounds work, if you ask me, from what we can see, because when we do our trials, we also inoculate, so we try to facilitate the infection, and we can note the differences accordingly. But it's just, It's just the challenge with something that doesn't just, the switch doesn't turn, it's not off one day and then it turns on and everything's flowering.
Could I add a bit of good news? We
Yes,
have all
please
this
do.
complication in the system, right? But Paul mentioned that these products are really effective. The products that are labeled for head scab also do a very excellent job on non-head scab diseases as well, that often co-occur with the head scab or follow on as ripening happens. So some of those flagleaf diseases, some of those like gloom blotches, that, purpley brownish color that you might see sometimes as ripening happens, they're all really nicely controlled by all of the head scab products. So that's great. And so if you are treating for head scab at head scab timing, you can also expect to get cleaner grain as you head towards harvest. The other thing I wanted to mention, just so that folks aren't even thinking about it, is we can't use any of the strobilurin products on head scab. And that is because the researchers have found that using a strobilurin, which is also called a QRI, any of those products have the capability of making the mycotoxin worse. So the fungus might produce more toxin in the situation where you used one of those types of fungicides to try and control. So even if you got less fungus, you could potentially get more toxin, and we don't want to do that. So those are not labeled, so you don't even have to worry about it if you're using only labeled products for, this disease. So, just to keep in mind, that's why.
And I think mentioned it once, but the label's the law, right? We have to keep saying that because we recognize that there are products that it makes sense to have one fungicide that you can use, and they are effective in multiple crops at multiple times. But this is one of those very practical, real world examples that if you just go out and use one thing without looking at it, we can kind of exacerbate some of these issues if we're not reading labels and staying on the label. So the kind of encouragement to something like this, if I think I've got it right, is we're going to look at head scab primarily, right? That's going to be our primary focus if we're targeting this. We kind of scroll down through here, we find the things that have good efficacy, and then we kind of move right to left and we look at things like the leaf rust or this, what else we have, stem rust, or the blotch or things like that. And we see what's going to come along for the ride, and we target good or excellent or very good in those as well to target what else we have out in our field as we make this application. But really what we want to focus on is where are we going to get the best control of the head scab, and then we see what our secondaries would be that we can control while we're doing this.
Yeah. No, Justin, that's a really good point. In our observations here in Pennsylvania the last couple of years, probably after head scab, once we make that decision, we've seen an increase in leaf rust, and we've been able to document good control over that in different types of trial. And it's also right there with your Nidorum blotch, the Septoria, Staganospora combinations. That would probably be what follows in that continuum of what we're doing at that flowering application. Thankfully, we don't pick up. I'm trying to remember the last time I saw stripe rust. There's several factors that might be driving it. We might just be, knock on wood, our position as where Pennsylvania is relative to sort of the movement of that pathogen. And I can't recall either the last time I would have seen stem rust in that combination. So what you hear from like the Great Plains and a lot of the areas, some of the other areas of in the US, we're, knock on wood, we're lucky in that respect of really having, I think right now, a fairly well-defined set of diseases that we're kind of messing around with or targeting with some of these decisions.
One last question I have, and then we'll wrap up here, is so we get to the end of the season, maybe we applied a fungicide because we thought it would be helpful given the question the risk assessment tool, right? We saw that we had a high risk. We saw enthesis happen. We were able to get someone out there to make your application. Okay, maybe we didn't do all of that right, and we got scab. What can we do? If you do see scab in your field, how do we know that we have a level that's going to be problematic for us? And are there things we can do in the grain cleaning process before delivering it, or places we can bring it to reduce our risk of toxin?
Yeah, so it's actually really good to scout after the fact in this case. So like I said, about 3 weeks after flowering, that's the vulnerable stage. That's when you would start to see if you did get scab. So you can look at that head, and most of the head will still be green at that point. But if you have scab, you can have some bleached kernels. You can have some starting to turn orange. If you start to see bleached kernels, that's a really good indicator that you probably did get infected, unless you had some freeze event that could throw you for a loop. But that's the time that you get to see, okay, how bad was it? And it's also important to know that even if you got a lot of scab infection, you might not end up getting a really high level of mycotoxin, and vice versa. So you could not see very much infection, and then at the end, when you're, trying to sell your grain, you have an unusually high amount of mycotoxin. That's because of the way the weather shaped up subsequent to that infection. So different weather can cause the fungus to do different things metabolically. So keep those in mind. But you do know if you have a lot that you can see, you have probably a higher chance of having some mycotoxin. So if you have a great amount in there, it's probably worth potentially talking to your insurance agent if you do have that crop insured. Because if you wanted to make a claim, they would need to come out or tell you what they want you to do before you harvest. If not, there's a few things you can do when you're combining. That includes try and combine your cleanest fields first, so you're not getting a bunch of spores and nasty kernels in your combine, and maybe save that, if you can, save the scabby field till the end. But when you do that field, you can turn up your fan pretty high and adjust the concaves so that you end up shooting a lot of the lightest grain out the back of the combine. Yes, it'll stay in your field and you have to deal with that, but you've already got a lot of fungus in that field anyway. You'd rather it be out there than in your grain bin. So those are a few things that can reduce the amount, but not totally eliminate it.
Yeah, and I think a lot of these things we can extend to our ear rots as well, right? If you've had fields with ear rots and have taken, whatever tactics you've used maybe to keep that grain separate, it's going to be very similar, because oftentimes the fungi basically makes those kernels lighter, and that's why that increasing the fan speed can be effective. And I think you brought up a good point. If we're on the front end staggering our plantings of wheat, maybe using different varieties, we have different levels in every field. So really getting out there and taking a look and assessing that. If you only get into one field and it has a lot of scab, you might think everything has a lot of scab. That might not be the case, right? If you were staggering plantings, maybe the microclimate's a little different in different areas. So all of that's very useful, and I think there are things you can do after the fact. So yeah, I think we're over an hour now, so I'll move us to a close here. I wanted to thank you guys for coming on. I think this has been a very useful conversation. I think as we move towards the middle of our small grain season, it's really great to think about these things and get ahead of our management decisions, right? If we play catch up, we won't time any of this right? So is there anything else you guys want to say before we leave here?
All I'd say is if any of our listeners have any questions, reach out to your local extension educator, reach out to us here in Pennsylvania or the region as well. But this is a system you want to be out there scouting, and you want to be able to address the growth stage to make the best decisions possible, and then everything kind of like dominoes start to line up, and and fall into place depending on what you do there. So we're here for you. You know, we've got a lot of resources that hopefully can help you make some of those decisions.
And I want to say, I don't know that this is right or not, but growing anything is complicated. But I think wheat and small grains is a little more challenging, because if you look at the list of quality factors used to sell and assess small grains compared to corn and soybeans and maybe some others, again, please don't, I don't need hate mail, but at least it'd be mail at all, right? It is very complicated, right? As we start getting into the chemical analysis that's being done with falling numbers and these other components that come along with small grains, every year I see people or talk to growers that I work with, and it seems there's always a reason to dock us on wheat, you know, and this is one of these things that we have a little bit of control on. I'm not saying we have 100% control, but take advantage of the things we do have an opportunity to kind of work around or work with. And I think that's the importance of this one, is understand that you run a high risk potential of having loads rejected, or just not being able to sell it, or not having a quality product. And this could be a good ROI for your dollar to go out and spray and scout and do something like this to really save you a lot of headache in the long run on something like this. So understand that if you're doing the small grains, it's a lot different than what you're looking at with corn and beans, where you show up, they look for a couple bugs, they look for how bad they're cracked. But this is getting pretty serious business with the wheats and the cereals now.
Yeah, and I would say if you're doing something like malting barley, even more so. So talk to your buyer and see what their thresholds are for what they'll accept, and then work backwards from there.
Yeah, that's a great point. You know, if we know what they're testing for, we have a better idea of what our priorities for control are. So, Paul, Alyssa, thank you guys again for coming on. I think this was a great conversation. And next time we have a disease we're thinking about, we'll have you guys back on. So thank you very much. And to our listeners, thank you guys for tuning in to another episode of the Agronomy Highlights podcast.